Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Agersfar Saga and the Spoken Books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 5. Baz had a lot of time to regret his decision to trip that Cityless on the walk back to Torchsire Library with Deliritous and Rox. They'd left Delilah behind in Lyanna's care. She'd escort Delilah back to the library once she'd collected herself. What happened once she got there, that was another story. Deliritous kept rubbing at his cheek where Delilah had slapped him. Deliritous wasn't one to go meting out severe punishments to his speakers. Baz ought to know, as some readers would have killed him for things he'd said that Deliritous had just laughed off. Being struck by one's property was another book entirely, though. Even Baz had never hit Deliritous, despite the number of times he'd thought of doing so. Still, given the circumstances, namely, Delilah having just been viciously attacked and, more to the point, Deliritous' extreme insensitivity, likely nothing serious would have come of Delilah's slip in decorum. But she'd not only hit Deliritous, but done so in front of representatives of all erstwhile's libraries, which meant the Duke was sure to hear of it. And the Duke was not nearly as milquetoast as his son when it came to discipline. Ordinarily, Deliritous couldn't be expected to stay quiet even under the most serious of circumstances, say, when the Conservator's lead torturer is questioning a public enemy. But even he maintained a brooding silence as they marched up the cobble road toward the library. Not even a simple, "Hey, thanks for saving my life, Baztian," or even a lame wisecrack about how that knife had nearly given him a new ear piercing. Perhaps outright gratitude was more than Baz could expect, but a joke at least would have been an acknowledgement that, if Baz wasn't a slave, he would have been deserving of thanks. Even Rox had given Baz a nod and a grunt that might have been interpreted by some as gratitude, though not even a slave should be desperate enough to believe a Harbour is showing him any sort of humanity. Baz knew all too well that Rox would crush his skull at a word from Deliritous. Blissfully, Torchsire Library wasn't that far from Xavier Library, particularly when no one tried to drop any doors on you, and they arrived before Baz's brooding could drive him completely insane. The building was certainly nicer than any in which ordinary citizens lived, but as far as erstwhile's libraries went, it was rather ordinary. A set of wide stone steps led up to the main entrance, which was flanked by a column to either side, each of which had a single angled flagpole about halfway up its length displaying wine-colored banners bearing the Torchsire sigil, crossed torches with a book between them. A single guard stood at the entrance, head leaning back against the wall, not paying particular attention to anything. The library had a second story with windows of ordinary glass and a gabled roof, but no towers, as was popular amongst many of the other libraries. None would ever admit it, but it was clear to Baz those others were just imitating Xavier Library, so in that regard he figured Torchsire was coming out ahead, though whether it was a purposeful act of architectural rebellion on the Duke's part or a mere lack of funds that kept Torchsire from going with the trend, Baz wasn't certain. The guard at the door perked up in a hurry when he saw Deliritous approaching, giving him a stiff salute. "Master Deliritous, the Duke left word for me to send you straight to the receiving room when you arrived." Deliritous sighed. Yes, I shouldn't be surprised that Father's already heard what happened. We'd best get on with it, Rox. Won't be any better if we keep him waiting." "Truth," Rox agreed with a rumble. "You'd better come too, Baztian. No telling who Father might be entertaining today. He'll want me to keep up appearances." Baz glowered, but didn't object. Of course, Deliritous only wanted him there to look good in front of his father. Never mind that Baz had just saved the library's heir from a gruesome demise. The receiving room was at the back of the library, a silly tactic. Scribes forbid if the Duke had to walk to see a guest in his own home. No, the guests had to come to him. It was particularly petty since it took all of 15 seconds to walk across the modestly sized Torchsire Library to reach the room. If this were Xavier Library, they'd have had to walk up 7 flights and stop for oxygen 3 times before reaching their destination. The room was longer than it was wide, with more Torchsire banners hanging on the walls, along with a few bookcases that held ordinary books. Not even Xavier had enough spoken books that they could afford to use them as decorations for a receiving room. A burgundy carpet fringed in gold to match the Torchsire banners led down the room's center and terminated at a raised platform upon which sat a single chair with a back that would have towered over even rocks had he sat in it. In that chair sat Duke Octavinal Torchsire, third of his name. His red silk jacket likely would have gone a long way to paying for that tower his library was lacking, and the calf-high cordovan boots would be worth at least a few bricks as well. His hands were folded in his lap, though even the dark leather gloves that covered them couldn't entirely conceal their deformity. 2 of the Duke's speakers were chained to an iron loop on the wall behind the chair. They wore dark robes similar to Baz's, one with the dragon patch marking her a destroyer, the other with the Enigma's scales stitched over one breast, marking him an influencer. They each had a strip of cloth tied around their heads where their eyes would have been. Baz did his best not to look at them. Some readers thought the best way to eliminate the possibility of a speaker learning to read was simply to prevent them from ever being able to see the words. Beside the Duke's chair stood a short, bald man. He wore the same leather mask as rocks over his nose and mouth, and his biceps made boulders seem like soft things. His razor was extended and resting on his shoulder. Dark eyes tracked their movements as they entered. Aside from the Duke and his Harbour and speakers, there were 6 others in the room, divided into 2 trios. The Duke was observing the duel from beneath his receding hairline with what seemed minimal interest. It was a staged match, which meant the Harbours were using blunted weapons and the readers only using books that carried a low risk of injury. The contestants were Deliritous' Aunt Trivinal and Uncle Salastair. They stood on opposite sides of the receiving room, rapiers in hand and mobile lecterns extended, each holding a book. Trivinal was employing a creator, while Salastair was using a destroyer, and each had their Harbour, of course. Neither was anywhere close to the size of rocks, but they were still huge, muscle-bound men wearing the leather masks of their trade. The teams were arrayed in what Baz knew from watching many a match, Deliritus never permitted him to participate in one, as a standard formation, with each reader and speaker hanging back while the Harbours pounded on one another out in the room's center. Rules were straightforward. First team to score 3 touches of any kind on the other's reader, whether with fist, weapon, or spell, was the victor. Baz had always thought the simplest tactic would be to have your speaker rush the other reader while he was looking down at his or her book, but of course that was forbidden. A speaker wasn't permitted to lay hands on a reader even in duels. The round had just started, Harbours still approaching each other warily, readers just beginning to utter their first spells. Salastair's destroyer struck first, tiny bolts of lightning crackling over Trivinal's head. At nearly the same moment, though, Trivinal's speaker finished repeating the words Trivinal had read aloud, and a blinding aura enveloped the reader, deflecting the lightning. This volley repeated several times, Salastair alternating between trying to hit Trivinal directly and aiming for her speaker. Each time, Trivinal's creator was successful in blocking the bolts with the shield of blinding light. After the 5th lightning attack, and with the Harbours still locked in a duel at the room's center, Trivinal changed tactics. She whispered a few hurried words into her speaker's ear, then released the straps on her mobile lectern, permitting it to fall to the floor, book and all. Salastair blinked in surprise as Trivinal began to rush toward him. With a curse, he flipped to a different page in his book. But before he could speak, he cried out as a bright light flashed right in front of his eyes. He flailed about, temporarily blinded. Salastair's Harbour disengaged from Trivinal's and attempted to intercept her, but an identical light flashed in his face. The Harbour kept his poise much better than his speaker, but still stumbled a step, and his weapon swung wide of Trivinal as she bobbed to one side. A moment later, she planted her rapier into Salastair's chest. "Point," said the Duke with little enthusiasm. "That's 3 for Trivinal. Match to her." Salastair glowered at his sister. "You let your speaker cast from memory?" She shrugged, giving him a sly smile. "Come now, brother. You've never permitted your speaker to memorize a simple spell or two? Lighting a candle? Soothing a headache? There's no lasting harm she could cause with that bright light, and she knows my Harbour would have her head off in a moment if she even has a dream of doing me ill." "Bah!" Salastair waved a hand to Trivinal. "It's dangerous, and you know it. If I ever caught mine speaking on his own, it'd be the whipping post for him." "That sort of narrow-mindedness is why you just lost," Trivinal said, her smile expanding. "That's enough," the Duke said. "I have other matters to attend to now. Out." Both Salastair and Trivinal glowered at that, giving curt bows in the Duke's direction before exiting the receiving room. Each nodded to Deliritous as they passed by, but there was no warmth in the gestures. Deliritous either didn't notice or didn't care, as he bowed low to them in return. Baz waved to their speakers, but neither so much as looked at him. Not surprising. Ever since word had gotten out about what had happened to Tax, and more importantly, why it had happened to him, none of the speakers liked to associate with him. "You two wait here," Deliritous said after the room had emptied. He gulped visibly, then made his way down the carpet to his father. Rox didn't move an inch, just staring after Deliritous. Baz sighed, wishing to go lean against the wall, but knowing that would never do in the Duke's presence. He settled for slouching in place. "Father," Deliritous began as he stopped at the dais, "perhaps you've heard about the mockery of our library that you permitted your bed-warmer to perpetrate?" "Oh yes, I heard." Deliritous flinched as if he found the words just as painful as Delita's earlier slap. "Well, she had some reason to—" "Property never has reason to subvert its owner, Deliritous. You're softer than a pigskin and too often only marginally smarter. It'll be 20 lashes for her. I've already scheduled it for tomorrow." "But, Father, the trials. We leave in just 2 days." "You ought to have considered that before you led her to believe that such insolence could go unpunished. I warned you over getting too familiar with your slaves, Deliritous. Consider it a fatherly mercy that I don't have her executed. As it is, the other libraries will be talking behind our backs, speaking of Torchsire's weakness for merely whipping a speaker who struck out at her reader." Deliritous opened his mouth, shut it again, then repeated the process several times. Finally, he seemed to decide his father wasn't going to bend and shifted topic. "Well, the trials do begin in 2 days. I'll need a replacement. Perhaps I could take your influencer in Delita's place?" "My influencer?" The Duke glanced over his shoulder to the man who stood chained behind his chair. He did nothing to acknowledge he was being talked about, face angled slightly away from the Duke's chair as if staring off into the distance. Stop runes were well and good, but in a world where the spoken word is power, silence is slavery, and speakers learned from an early age to hold their tongues or else lose them. "Absolutely not," the Duke said. "I've multiple meetings with representatives from Fortune over the next several weeks regarding our latest trade agreements. And you've seen the sorts of damage Hellar Xavier can exact with his speakers. No, I certainly won't risk you taking my most valuable speaker into the trials." Baz barely suppressed a laugh. It would be the Duke's own son on the receiving end of Hellar's damage once the trials began, yet the Duke's prime concern was keeping his property intact. "Well," Deliritous said, drawing himself up a little taller, "perhaps I could take your—" "No," the Duke went on, raising a hand to silence Deliritous again. "I'll need my other speakers as well. It would be shameful to present myself for negotiations with those swindlers from Fortune with fewer than 3. How could we possibly hope to win the Triumvirate Congress chairmanship away from Farston Liamina if such an embarrassment reached his ears? The man's a prig, but also an opportunist. Appearances matter, Deliritous. Must I always remind you of that?" Deliritus's lips thinned, but otherwise he weathered the continued insults far better than Baz would have. "Well, no, Father, not at all. I'm rather fond of appearances myself. But if you intend to keep all your speakers here, and Delilah won't be able to stand, much less travel, after you whip her, that doesn't leave me much in the way of options." Baz's mouth went dry as the Duke's plan dawned on him. "You'll just have to take your own destroyer. You've had nearly 10 years to train him, ever since you took it upon yourself to ruin the best speaker this library has had since the burning. I know it will be a shift in your strategy, going from a creator to a destroyer, but you'll manage." "You mean," Deliritus said, seeming for a moment unable to form coherent sentences, "take Baztian with me on the trials?" Baz was suddenly so lightheaded he nearly stumbled into rocks before catching himself. The Harbour glanced at him and gave him an indecipherable grunt. "Baztian? Oh, yes. That's what you call the destroyer. What have I told you about naming them? Creates needless attachment." "What about Yeltax? You named him." "That," the Duke said, eyes narrowing and voice growing cold, "was different." Deliritus dropped his eyes from the Duke's glare. "Well, I'd hardly say I'm attached to Baztian," Deliritus muttered. Then, in a slightly louder, pleading tone, said, "I'm not sure he's quite ready for something like the trials. Couldn't you stay Delilah's whipping until after I return?" Not ready, Baz thought. Deliritus had used him for a speaking exactly one time in the past month, and only a handful times more than that in the past year. A reader and speaker generally prepared for months prior to the trials. Hellar Xavier had likely been preparing for years. Not ready? Baz would surely have had an outburst if he hadn't been stuck right in the middle of laughing and breaking down into tears. "Not ready?" the Duke said. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Deliritus. You've only 2 speakers, and I've had you handle nearly all the supplicants' requests since you turned 20. It will be fine." "But, Father," Deliritus said, lowering his voice and speaking through his teeth, though the whole room could still plainly hear him. "He saw what I did to his brother, and he's a destroyer. What if he... well, you know." The Duke waved a hand at Deliritus. "He was just a lad when that happened. I doubt he even remembers. It will be fine." The Duke smiled, but when Deliritus didn't immediately agree with him, the smile evaporated, and he said in a much colder tone, "It must be fine, Deliritus. Our library needs a good showing in the trials. We haven't even brought a book back since I won my heir. Your uncle came back empty-handed. Your aunt didn't even make it to tome. You're expected to bring back a new spoken book that's at least as useful as the one I found. We can't have an heir to the Torchsire Library who lost his trials. Understood?" Deliritus stared at the Duke for some time. Finally, he said, "I understand perfectly, Father. May I go now? I've some preparations to make." "Certainly. Please do." Deliritus bowed, turned, and strode away. When he reached Baz, he said, "I guess you'd better get ready to accompany me to Tome." Baz felt as horrified as Deliritus sounded. Chapter 6. Deliritus's tongue slipped on a sharp syllable, and he faltered for a moment, though he recovered well enough that it might have saved the spell had he actually been reading it for Baz to repeat. They were in the speaking room, selecting the volumes they'd be taking on the trials. Deliritus's uncle had joined them, and he was reviewing pronunciations with the Torchsire heir. Both Rox and Salastair's Harbour were standing close to Baz, ensuring he didn't try to cast any of the spells Deliritus was reading. Baz was leaning against the wall with his head back and eyes closed, trying to think of some way he could get out of this mess. "Not bad," Salastair gruffed as Deliritus completed the spell he'd been reading. "Your diction's improved significantly." Deliritus nodded, not looking particularly pleased. "Improved, maybe, Uncle, but I'd been doing nothing but practicing creation for months." Deliritus cast a sour look at Baz, as if Delilah's sudden unavailability was his fault. It was as if Deliritus had already forgotten that he'd have had a dagger sticking from his chest if it hadn't been for Baz. Deliritus nodded, not looking particularly pleased. "Improved, maybe, Uncle, but I'd been doing nothing but practicing creation for months. Deliritus cast a sour look at Baz, as if Delita's sudden unavailability was his fault. It was as if Deliritus had already forgotten that he'd have had a dagger sticking from his chest if it hadn't been for Baz. "Huh," Salastair said. "Well, my advice for the trials would be to get away from that Xavier boy as fast as you can. Probably best to just avoid Tome entirely. I've seen him in duels, and I'm not sure there's a better reader in Erstwhile. His Harbour's a piece of work, too. You'll be dead if you stay around him for long." "I'll keep that in mind, Uncle, but I'm not sure Father would appreciate me not even trying to reach Tome and retrieve a book." Salastair shrugged. "Maybe, boy, but it's better to be alive and have an angry father than dead and a pleased one." Baz perked up a moment. Now there was an idea. If they simply hid in the countryside for a couple months, avoid the danger of the trials completely? "Perhaps," Deliritus said, sounding entirely unconvinced. Baz's flash of hope faded as quickly as it had come. "But you know how it's been, Uncle. For a while, when I was younger, things were looking up. After all those years of struggle following Father's accident, we'd finally begun bringing in funds once more. But over the past decade," Deliritus shrugged, "the library needs me to perform well at the trials, I think." "Best to just face the facts, lad. You're outclassed. Better to be around to take over for your father once he's dead than die out in the wilds." Baz couldn't have agreed more. He leaned his head back against the wall, shutting his eyes. "I think we're done here, Uncle," Deliritus said. "Thank you for your assistance." Salastair looked as if he was going to say more, but then simply nodded and left without another word. Not even a "good luck, nephew." His Harbour followed after him. "What do you think of that spell I just read, Baztian?" Deliritus asked after his uncle had left. "Think we can handle it, my good chap?" Baz replied without opening his eyes. Deliritus knew full well it would take them weeks to get comfortable with a spell of the length he'd just read. "Come now, young Baztian, what do you have to be down about? It's me who ought to be sulking. How about water spells? How do you feel about that element?" Baz opened his eyes, though he was careful not to even look in the direction of the book Deliritus indicated. A speaker who looked at a book might start getting ideas, or so the readers seemed to think. It was difficult to entirely avoid them, though, as Deliritus had nearly every destructive book the library owned stacked on the speaking room's podium, ones that drew on each of the 5 elements: fire, earth, water, light, and shadow. In theory, there was no limit to the number of books one could bring on the trials, but there was only so much one could carry, even with horses, and then there was the consideration of how many books one wished to risk out in the wilds. The Duke had limited Deliritus to only 7, an entirely arbitrary number so far as Baz could make out. Deliritus had been trying to get Baz to participate in the decision-making process even before his uncle had arrived, but Baz was having none of it. He slumped back against the wall, arms crossed. The room was cold as always, but entering it always sent a chill down Baz's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He didn't care what anyone said. It wasn't his imagination that he could still hear the echoes of Tax's cries of pain reverberating off the room's rafters. Deliritus prattled on. "I overheard Hellar the other day saying he was taking 20 books with him. That's more than double what Father has allotted me, us." He grinned sheepishly at Baz. In return, Baz scowled at the space over Deliritus's right shoulder. Glaring right at the reader would have been impudent, but scowling at empty air wasn't prohibited. Petulant, probably, but not prohibited. Deliritus cleared his throat. "Yes, well, anyway, the point is, I've got a lot on my lectern, so to speak, but you don't see me moping, do you? No time for a thing like that. If they take your legs, keep crawling. Eh, Rox? See, I'm learning. That sounds like something an Enigman would say." "The words mean what they mean," Rox agreed. Now that Deliritus was no longer reading, the Harbour had moved to stand by the door, looking out into the hallway, likely keeping an eye out for another supplicant to threaten with his razor, like that lady with the chicks all those years ago. "That they do, my massive confederate," replied Deliritus. "So what do you say, Baztian? I know you've a proclivity for fire, so we'll take a couple of those." Deliritus had already stacked several tomes of red-tinted leather on the lectern, and one of the books on general disease culling. Who knows what nastiness we'll find out in the wilds? You ought to know, Baz thought. He very much doubted Helar was leaving to guesswork what sort of dangers he might face on the trials. Likely, he had a whole team writing research reports for him on every possible sickness one could contract, and the books needed to counteract them. That leaves us with 3 more, given Father's quota of 7. How do you feel about earth power, Baztian? Could be handy if we run into a worm. Use earth to suppress its fire. For that matter, I suppose water spells would be handy as well. There's always the chance of encountering a fire breather, too. And let's see. Deliritus turned his back and rummaged through the shelves, coughing on some dust. We've this tome of elemental light spells. The leather cover was cracked, and a small piece actually came off in Deliritus's hand as he tried to open it. He eyed it with chagrin, then set it aside. Well, perhaps not that one. I've always found light to be more useful for creation, anyway. It's Delita's favorite element, in fact. Did you know? Baz increased the strength of his glare over Deliritus's shoulder. Well, perhaps it doesn't matter whether you knew that. He rebusied himself thumbing through the volumes of spoken books on the speaking room's shelf. His hand stopped on one, shying back as if it might bite him. After a moment he plucked it out, holding it away from himself at arm's length. The book's leather cover was unnaturally black, almost like it was a hole slashed into the airspace it occupied. Even Baz had a hard time not looking at it, though it hurt his eyes to do so. Whenever he didn't stare directly at it, he'd have sworn it glowed an iridescent violet around the edges, though whenever he tried to focus on it, the glow wasn't there. Put that away before you hurt yourself, Master Deliritus, Baz said, still trying to eye the book from the corner of his eye, while simultaneously trying to look at it directly to see if the glow was truly there. Speaking spells of destruction from a book of shadow will turn both our tongues blacker than that tome. Deliritus said. Perhaps you're right. But I've seen Marla Kolnar do some pretty incredible things with shadow. Just a word or two and I've seen her vaporize rats to dust. Deliritus set the book aside with care, staring at it thoughtfully before shaking his head and looking back to Baz. Everyone seems so focused on Helar, but I don't know. I mean, I know he's good. Great, even. But he's not a brute. Readers aren't supposed to harm other readers in the trials. I think he'll abide by that. Marla, on the other hand. Baz gave a noncommittal sniff in reply. There were no rules about killing another reader's speaker during the trials, so he cared little for how safe Deliritus felt. If either Helar or Marla saw an opportunity to rid Deliritus of the advantage of having a speaker to aid him, they'd do it without thinking twice. Bloody burning books! How was Baz going to get out of this? So what do you say, Baztian? Should we take the earth or water books with us? Baz squeezed his hands into fists. I don't know, Master Deliritus. Probably we should take the tomes with which your speaker has more practice. With which element did you more recently have me perform a speaking? Deliritus grimaced and looked back down to the books he'd stacked on the lectern. Baztian, you know I've my reasons for using you sparingly. Nothing against you, chap. An untrusted speaker is a mute one, Baz muttered, and a mute speaker is a useless one. Ah, the words mean what? Quiet, Rocks, Deliritus said. It's not that I don't trust you, Baztian. If anything, I trust too much. I don't have any siblings myself, but I remember seeing my mother... Well, another thing we don't need to speak of. But I know the relationship you had with poor old Yeltax, and you were here when I did, well, what I did. I did the best I could, you know, after Father gave you to me. Lots of readers would have killed you, you know, rather than go through the trouble of worrying over whether you might fry them each time you were read to. And I'm not certain I could entirely blame you for such a reaction. Don't you see? It was really the best for both of us, old chum, right? You not tempted to turn spells on me, and we both get to keep pumping the old air in and out? Yes, Baz said, still looking over Deliritus's shoulder. Very kind of a reader not to murder a kid for being upset over watching what you did to his brother." "Baztian," Deliritus said, brows falling, "would you stop that over-the-shoulder talk and look at me? You know, I'm not stupid. If I wanted to punish you for insubordination, I could, whether you speak directly to me or not." Baz laughed and turned his eyes to meet Deliritus's own. "I know you could punish me, master." He said the word like a curse. "Let me ask you something. What do you think Hellar would call a reader who failed to give one of his 2 speakers any training at all, then had just 2 days to prepare him for the most important moment of his life?" That was going too far, and Baz knew it. But blast it, Deliritus really was an idiot. Deliritus pounded a fist on the lectern. "That's quite enough, speaker. I ought to have Rox teach you a lesson." Baz heard the leather of Rox's mask creak as the massive buffoon looked over his shoulder. "My oath only requires me to act when your safety is in—" "Oh, shove off, Rox," Deliritus whined. The large man shrugged and turned back to watching the hall. "I think I can finish up here on my own, Baztian. Why don't you go and get those supplies you were supposed to get this morning? And no dallying this time." Dallying? It had been Deliritus's foolish pride in public appearances that had diverted Baz from getting the supplies earlier. He thought of a few other nasty remarks, mostly about Deliritus's lack of mental acuity, but he bit them back and left the speaking room without another word. He stopped a moment at the doorway, Rox's bulk blocking his way, but the massive man shuffled to one side without a word to let him by. Baz stormed out. Hello, friends. Welcome back to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I feel like I need to come up with a name for all my listeners out there. I'll think about that. Anyone has any ideas, shoot me an email, dtkane@dtkane.com. All right, so we just finished reading chapters 5 and 6, and we'll launch into our analysis there in just a minute. Just a couple quick updates for me here. First, I finally got my physical copy of my book. Here it is for all you watching on the YouTubes. The Acktus Trials by D.T. Kane. Reading books can get you killed. Yeah, it's pretty exciting to see your own book in print. This is the second time in my life so far I've seen that. I'm enjoying it so far. In fact, I'm using this one a lot more than I used of my first novel, because I'm using this to help prepare for the podcast. I'm actually reading through it and highlighting important things that I think I want to go over. So there's that. Let's see. Editing-wise, I'm about halfway through my handwritten edits to part 3 of the Spoken Books Uprising, which is Declaimer's Flight, for those of you keeping score at home. And I'm starting to stew over the plot for part 4 as well. I'll be working on that starting in, I've got my sticky notes over on my monitor here, February 25th, which I think is a Friday, right? Friday? Yes. So I'll be starting my outline in earnest for that in a couple weeks once I'm done doing my hand edits of part 3 and get those entered into the computer. I do have I've got a very rough outline for the whole series right now. I think I've mentioned before, I have it sketched out for 12 stories. Like I said, right now I think it's 12 books, but I'm not sure. I don't think it'll be more than 12 books. Could be less. Well, we'll have to see. But a lot of that is it's 1 or 2 paragraphs describing, especially some of the later books. And usually as I'm drafting, whatever book I'm drafting, I will, as I come up with ideas, I'll just jot them down or type them down. So I just have this flow of consciousness kind of big block of text of ideas for the next book, and I sit down with that and separate it out and then try to put it into a logical story structure, if you will. Excuse me. So that's what I'll be doing with part 4 here in a couple weeks. But us here in the book club, we've got a ways to go before we get there. So let's see. I'm also working on a short story, I think, set in narration that I'm gonna give away to all of you out there for free once it's written. So I'm kicking around some ideas for that. But if anyone has any ideas for that, let me know too, and maybe I'll work some of those in that I get from the listeners out there. Just a quick note, unrelated to my writing, I'm planning a trip to Chicago in a few weeks. Looking forward to that. My wife and I really like traveling, but the pandemic's made that a little difficult lately. But there's a conference for my day job out in Chicago in a few weeks, and my wife happens to have some time off from her job, so we're gonna jet out there for about 5 or 6 days. So if anyone has any favorite restaurants or things to do in Chicago, drop them in the comments or shoot me an email. Would love to get some additional ideas for our trip. And finally, I think I'm going to start doing this in my email newsletter each week, which you can sign up for over at dtkane.com if you're interested. Just one email a week. Not going to spam you or anything. And my goal is always to try to give you something that's of value to you and also free in those newsletters. So I'm not going to be just trying to sell you my books every week if you sign up for the newsletter. But I think I'm going to start sharing what I am personally reading each week too. I thought maybe you'd find that interesting, or maybe just when I start new books. But let's see. Usually I read a audio book and a physical book concurrently. So depending on where I am, always have something to read / listen to. So for reading right now, I am reading Stephen Brust's Vlad Taltos, the first 3 books there. The first 3 books are in a volume called The Book of Zureg. That's how that's pronounced there for those of you watching on the YouTubes. I don't know if that's really, the camera's really focusing on that, but Zureg, Jhereg. Very entertaining series. Some nice sarcastic wit from the main character in here, who is he's like an assassin who also knows magic. I like it. And this little guy here on the front, this little dragon-looking guy, is the main character's pet, and they can communicate psychically with one another. So it's fun. The books are pretty short. Like I said, this is like a 400-page book, and it's actually 430 pages. And it's the first 3 books in the series, and they're kind of standalones. I mean, each story references other stories, but it's much more like episodic than a serial. And then I am listening to The Silence of the Lambs right now. Not really fantasy, but that's narrated by Frank Muller. If anyone's familiar with him as an audiobook narrator, he narrated the first 4 of Stephen King's Dark Tower novels, and he's just a great narrator. Was a great narrator. Unfortunately, he passed away after a motorcycle accident some years ago. But really anything that, in fact, I'm pretty sure he passed away. I know he had a bad motorcycle accident many years ago, so please don't quote me on that. I'll look that up and clarify in the show notes if he is in fact still alive. So sorry about that, but either way, he is a excellent narrator, and if you have the opportunity to listen to any books that he narrated, I definitely recommend it. Okay, so let's launch into the analysis here of chapters 5 and 6. Obviously, we'll start with chapter 5. Get a quick sip of tea there. Right, so we start off walking back to Torchsire from Xavier Library after Baz saved Deliritus from the Cityless, and then Deliritus had his little outburst over Delita's voice being ruined, so he's not going to be able to take her with him to the trials, and we learned she promptly slapped him after he said that, which he almost certainly deserved, but that's also going to mean trouble for her, right? Because she is a slave, and she hit Deliritus in front of, like all of these other readers, so they all saw it. So, probably not surprising, but Deliritus isn't the strictest disciplinarian, but, he's probably not going to be able to get out of punishing Delida when she did that in front of everyone, and his father certainly isn't going to let her off the hook, right? On the walk back here, we also see Baz brooding, right, over how Deliritous didn't thank him for saving his life. I like this passage here that Baz gives us. I'll just read it here to you again. We can chat about it for a second. Not even a simple, "Hey, thanks for saving my life, Baztian," or even a lame wisecrack about how that knife had nearly given him a new ear piercing. Perhaps outright gratitude was more than Baz could expect, but a joke at least would have been an acknowledgement that, if Baz wasn't a slave, he would have been deserving of thanks. You know, it's showing a little self-awareness here, right, from Baz. You know, I think he's showing here he realizes that maybe Deliritous is constrained by their relative positions in society from outright thanking him. You know, but at the same time, he could do something, right, to show that he's got, you know, some gratitude for for still breathing because of Baz. You know, and even when Deliritous tells Baz to accompany him to the audience with his father, the Duke, it's really only because Deliritous wants to keep up appearances, right? You know, remember, you always got to be seen with a speaker when you're out in public. So, you know, Deliritous still kind of oblivious here to... either oblivious or he really is just as bad as the rest of the readers, right? You know, he doesn't care that Baz saved him. But the jury is still out on that for now. You know, in fact, I think Deliritus's insensitivity is kind of emphasized by the fact that Rox kind of actually I wrote something wrong here in the script. But you know, Rox gives Baz a nod of appreciation, right? So, you know, does this mean Deliritous is the real monster in the pair between him and Rox, or maybe it's not a commentary on Deliritous so much as it is, you know, showing us that Rox isn't quite the horror that Baz has kind of made him out to be so far. I don't know. We'll have to keep reading on here, but you know, definitely lots of interesting stuff there in the kind of the opening pages. Right, so we finally get back to Torchsire Library, and the guard at the entrance immediately tells Deliritous that his father wants to see him immediately in the receiving room, right, which is kind of like the audience chamber of the library. And they go down there. You know, Baz makes this sarcastic comment about the Duke making everyone walk to come see him, right? And Baz is rolling his eyes at that, particularly since, you know, Baz says something like, you know, the library's not even that big, so it's stupid. And okay, we'll walk 15 seconds to the receiving room. It's not even really emphasizing that the Duke's making you work to come see him. But we get there, and the Duke's mounted up on his perch above the rest of the room, right? But I'm going to jump just a little out of order here. We'll get to the Duke in a minute, but first we get a duel, right? So this is cool. And I like this. I like creating little games in my books and kind of coming up with the rules for them. I've done that a few times. This is the first time we've seen it in the Acktus Trials here. But so we basically have two teams, right? We got the speaker, reader, and Harbour on each side, and the rules are pretty straightforward. You have to touch the other team's speaker 3 times before they do it to you, right? And it's broken down into rounds. So, one person scores a touch, then you reset and you go at it again. And really the only other rule we learn is that speakers can't physically touch the other team's reader, right? You know, as Baz puts it, a speaker wasn't permitted to lay hands on a reader even in duels. Because Baz is like, well, geez, I would just run over there and, you know, slap the reader while he's looking at his book. But that's not allowed. So I'm not going to profess to be a master writer here or anything. But, you know, I'd like to think, at this point I've got some basics down. And I think this dueling scene is a good example of the old writer's adage, show, don't tell, right? I don't even think I had it in the original draft, but I realized I thought it'd be useful for really all of you out there to kind of see how this core trio of reader, speaker, Harbour all works together. And there wasn't really a great opportunity earlier on in the novel for you all to see that. So this idea of the duel came to me, and I thought that was a good way just to show you the basics of how this works. And I think the biggest takeaway is just how vulnerable the reader is during this duel, right? They basically just had to stand in place, staring down at their spoken book, which again is like hanging from this, this kind of miniature lectern they have like strapped around their necks on like a harness. And that you really see why they need their harbors, particularly here. Or, you can even see if you're actually like going into a war or a battle or something, how vulnerable the readers would be in a real battle like that too. Back when I played World of Warcraft, the readers would have been called the squishy of the party, right? They've got a lot of power, but they're going down quick if someone with a sword gets to them. So, right. And then we also get our first look at a creator in action here, right? Now that's the third type of speaker. We've got the destroyers, who are Baz is the destroyer, and then we saw the influencer over in the torture chamber. He was the one that was kind of trying to mind control the cityless to get them to answer questions. And then Deliritus's Aunt Trivinal is using a creator. And, they seem to be focused more on defensive types of magic, right? Deliritus's uncle Salastair is launching lightning at Trivinal with his destroyer, but her creator is blocking him with, I call it a blinding aura, right? But it's just a shield, right? She's throwing up a shield so the lightning bolts don't hit them. And they go back and forth for a while. Everything's pretty much deadlocked. And then, the Harbors are out there, they're hacking away at each other, but, they're not really getting anywhere. This seems kind of, I think Baz said this is a common formation, right? The speaker and the reader are hanging back, casting their long-range spells. And, it seems like the kind of like the baseline tactic. Well, one of the Harbors just tries to get around the other one to get to their speaker or reader here to score a point. So Trivinal decides to switch things up a little, though, right? And she kind of exploits the weakness that I just noted, and kind of the weakness that Baz noted too. Alastair staring down at his book, and then she drops hers and just charges him, right? And all she's got to do is touch him to score the point. And Alastair, he looks up. Oh, he's like, oh crap! Here she comes. He tries to flip to a different page in his book to cast a different spell to stop her, but then Trivinal's creator, and we'll come back to this a little more in a moment, but the creator causes a bright light to flash in his eyes, and it's too late. He's blinded. The Harbor can't get to her in time, and she hits him with her rapier, which, remember, we're using blunted weapons here. This isn't I think Baz calls it a staged match, but she hits him with the rapier, and the match is over, right? Apparently, the match had been going on for a while, and this was Trivinal's third point. But kind of, who wins here is really irrelevant. Now, an interesting point here is, Trivinal has her speaker cast this spell to blind Alastair, right? But she lets her speaker speak it from memory. She whispers into the speaker's ear, and then takes off, and it's not until a little bit later that the speaker actually casts it. Alastair is pretty pissed about this, right? He says it's dangerous, but Trivinal is, she's obviously less concerned. Let's see. She says, "You've never permitted your speaker to memorize a simple spell or two? Lighting a candle, soothing a headache. There's no lasting harm she could cause with that bright light, and she knows my Harbour would have her head off in a moment if she has a dream of doing me ill. If she even has a dream of doing me ill." Yeah, so a couple interesting points here. So there's some apparent disagreement over what's proper, right? Kind of, we have the two competing opinions. Alastair is clearly against permitting a speaker memorizing even the simplest spells, whereas Trivinal doesn't seem nearly so strict about that. So not all readers view the restrictions on speakers exactly the same. From this we see speakers don't always need to have the spell read to them immediately, right? We don't get into it much here, but eventually we're going to see that, so long as the speaker knows the words and is nearby the spoken book, they can cast the spell. So kind of, we're getting into advanced spoken book reading here now, but kind of different strategies here and different viewpoints amongst the readers over how to treat your speakers. And you can see both sides of it, right? It's, it can be useful and dangerous. Useful because you don't have to pull out these giant books every time you need something simple done, right? Like Trivinal says, well, geez, if they memorize the spell for lighting a candle, so what? But it is dangerous too, right? Because if a speaker does manage to memorize a spell, they could potentially cast it without having it read to them first. That's one of the reasons here that the books are always kept in these, in the speaking rooms, locked up. So, there isn't just books lying around that speakers could potentially read spells out of. Or I should say speak spells out of. Right. And that also drives home that limitation that we've seen several times already, about speakers not talking unless they're addressed. Right. Baz tells us, stop runes were well and good, but in a world where the spoken word is power, silence is slavery, and speakers learned from an early age to hold their tongues or else lose them. Right. So the Duke dismisses his brother and sister, and not too politely, right? Doesn't seem to be too much love lost between the Duke and his siblings, but, they also clearly respect his authority, though, right? Because, they make quick exits, even if, they've got sour expressions on their face while they're doing so. But Aunt and Uncle leave, and then let's take a look at our first description of Duke Octavinal Torchsire. In that chair sat Duke Octavinal Torchsire, third of his name. His red silk jacket likely would have gone a long way to paying for that tower his library was lacking, and the calf-high cordovan boots would be worth at least a few bricks as well. His hands were folded in his lap, though even the dark leather gloves that covered them couldn't entirely conceal their deformity. Oh, all right. Let's take this week's look behind the curtain here and talk about how I feel about descriptions for a minute. There. I'm laughing at myself. The note I wrote here. The descriptions are important. Obviously, I want to be painting this picture for you, but I just find them so boring to write. It feels like the story grinds to a halt during descriptions, and sometimes when I'm writing, especially a first draft, I'll literally just drop a note, describe this later, and then I'll skip on to something that's more interesting. Almost always, my story is, like 10% longer after my second draft as opposed to my first, and I am kind of an adder-inner instead of a taker-outer. There's probably a more eloquent way to say that, but there you go. Adder-inner, add-inner, I don't know. I'm definitely that, but it's also because I do leave myself notes like this, write this later, basically. So, there you go. And I do have kind of a philosophy that I do like to allow my readers to use their imaginations. So I don't like to bog you down with too much detail unless those details are really important. I'll give you some vital features of a place or a character, but you can fill in the rest. I don't care if you picture Octavinal with bushy eyebrows or yellow teeth or manicured nails. You can kind of do what you will with that. I mean, I guess as you get to know him a little better, your pictures of him will probably be a little similar. But I like I said, I don't care what color. what color, pants I think he's wearing or anything like that. Though, speaking of clothing, I will say it's not an accident that my opening description of him focuses mostly on his clothing. We know his library's poor, right? But he is dressed in fine clothes. Baz, in his characteristic way here, points out that for the cost of his clothing, he could probably afford to renovate the library, right? So, we've got, I'm setting up a picture of an arrogant man here who maybe he doesn't have his priorities quite straight, right? And we'll certainly see that too with how he treats his son here. We've also got his deformed hands. There's, important feature, right? I don't necessarily care how big or small you think Octavinal's nose is, but it's, the deformed hands. There's an important feature. He's the character with the messed up hands. Now, think back to Chapter 2. Remember, Deliritous did let slip back with, that old woman with the chicks that his father had an accident some time back, and, now, pretty good bet here we've seen what it is, right? His hands have kind of been ruined here. We don't know, what caused that, but, he did imply that it definitely set the library's finances back when it happened, and that's interesting, I guess, because, getting your hands wrecked, sure, I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. It definitely wasn't pleasant, I'm sure, but it's not like the Duke is a manual laborer here, right? So why did that have such a serious impact on the library's finances? And this is a little interesting tidbit that I'm just planting here, putting the poking the seed in the dirt here and planting it. It's not going to really be important to even this whole book, but tuck that away as we move deeper into the series. Right, so Duke Octavinal, he already knows what happened at the questioning of the Cityless, right? When Deliritous arrives. Maybe, and that's another little tidbit about him that's buried in here. We're going down to the next level of analysis with this one, but, the Duke has a great information network, right? I mean, that's what this is showing. We don't exactly know how quickly Deliritous left Xavier Tower after nearly being killed by the Cityless, but, it couldn't have been that long, and he went straight back to Torchsire. Yet the Duke already knows what happened. In fact, he seemed to have known way in advance, because the guard was already waiting there telling Deliritous he had to go to the speaking room. So, an arrogant man with priorities not straight, but a resourceful man, too. That's what we're getting from Octavinal here in these first few pages being introduced to him. Also, he's not a pleasant guy, is he? I mean, he doesn't even think to ask if his son's all right? The first thing he does is actually berate him, right? Making the library look bad. Permitting his speaker to have such a lapse in discipline as to strike him in public. It is an outrage. Duke Octavinal, even more interested in appearances than his son, apparently. And he also points out here, too, that, Deliritous, it wasn't a secret that he was sleeping with his female speaker, Delilah, there, right? Criticizing him for being too familiar with his slaves. And then, so we open with the criticism, and then here, the bomb drops, right? He's gonna have Delilah whipped for insubordination. I guess we're still priming the bomb here. The bomb's about to go off. But two things from this whipping, first he considers 20 lashes a fatherly mercy, right? And I hope no one out there has ever experienced any lashes, but 20 lashes, I'm not sure that's merciful under any definition of the word. And father is lamenting how bad he thinks that's going to make Torchsire look in front of the other libraries. He'd rather just kill Delilah, right? But maybe fatherly mercy, or maybe too, Torchsire can't really afford to kill any more of its speakers. They don't got enough money to replace them with. But Delilah was supposed to go on the trials with Deliritous, right? And she's not going to be able to go if she's recovering from a whipping. So who is going to go with him? So Deliritous' first reaction is, well, Father, let me borrow one of your speakers if you're going to do this to Delilah. And that's something I skipped over, actually, right? We get the description of Octavinal, but we also got the description of his two speakers, right? And there's talking about me focusing just on the significant details here, right? But, the significant detail from them is, they both have their eyes missing, right? Their eyes have been ripped out. They've got just the cloth bandages around their heads. And, again, thinking back to Chapter 2, again, I feel like I referenced Chapter 2 in every analysis of the podcast so far, and it is because, like I told you, I was setting a lot of stuff up there. But you remember that bad joke Deliritous told back in Chapter 2 about permitting Tax to keep his eyes? Well, now we see, up close and personal why that was just such a bad joke, because apparently some readers really do just remove their speaker's eyes. Because, if you can't see, you can't read. There's no braille in oration. If you're blind, you're not reading the spoken books. But of course, Octavinal isn't interested in permitting Deliritous to borrow any of his speakers, right? And again we see clearly making his priorities clear here, and Deliritus does not really seem to be one of them. Octavinal says, "I'll need my speakers as well. It would be shameful to present myself for negotiations with those swindlers from Fortune with fewer than 3. How could we possibly hope to win the triumvirate Congress chairmanship away from Farston Liamina if such an embarrassment reached his ears? The man's a prig, but also an opportunist. Appearances matter, Deliritus. Must I always remind you of that?" And he makes this offhand remark too that Baz takes the Duke to task for, obviously not aloud, but in his head. The Duke cites, haven't you seen the damage Hellar Xavier can exact with his speakers? And he gives that as another reason why he doesn't want Deliritus to take one of his speakers on the trials. And of course, Baz thinks in his head, well, Deliritus is going to be the one competing against Hellar, and he's going to be on the receiving end of that damage. But the Duke's not concerned about his son being on the receiving end of Hellar's damage. It's he's concerned about his speakers being ruined by Hellar. Okay, so now we get to the bomb, right? I jumped the gun a minute ago, but now the bomb goes off. So who does this leave, right? Deliritus only has 2 speakers, right? He's got Delida and Baz, and his father's not going to let him take any of his speakers. So Baz, right? we're left with Baz, and I know this probably isn't coming as much as a surprise to many of you out there. I didn't say this last week. It kind of says on the back cover blurb, right, that Baz is selected to go on the trials with his master. So, not too much of a surprise there. But now we are really propelled into the story here. Now we see where this is going. Baz is going to get ripped out of his ordinary life here into an adventure, right? This is the part of the story where the protagonist would usually start their adventure, but I'm using that term loosely here for Baz because obviously he is not excited about this. In fact, he's kind of horrified. He is unprepared in the extreme, it would seem. He notes that reader-speaker pairs usually spend months training for the trials. And, whereas we've got Deliritus here who doesn't even use Baz to do any speakings if he can help it. And Deliritus actually pretty much confirms Liana's earlier hypothesis, right, about why he doesn't use Baz. He thinks Baz is worried about seeking revenge, just like Liana said. But father, he saw what I did to his brother, and he's a destroyer. What if he, of course, his father clearly not too concerned about that, just more evidence of how out of tune he is with his son. He's like, Deliritus, you've had him for 10 years. Of course he's ready. I've been letting you do the supplicants for, since you were 20. So that's for 3 years, right? Because we know Deliritus was 13 in chapters 1 and 2, and now we're 10 years later. But, the Duke seems oblivious to how little Deliritus actually uses Baz. So obviously the Duke's not paying terribly close attention to what his son's doing. Or is he so oblivious? I guess we could also interpret this as the Duke purposefully setting his son up to fail. Maybe. Baz noted back in chapter 2, Deliritus really isn't the heir by choice, right? He's the Duke's only kid. Maybe the Duke actually wants Deliritus to fail so he can pick another heir. We see at the end of the chapter, the Duke is just like loading on the pressure on Deliritus, right? To bring back a book, right? No one from our family's brought one back since I won the trials in my year, Octavinal says. So lumping on, you got to live up to my, you got to live up to my example, and we can't have an heir who lost his trials, Deliritus. Is this sincere pressure, or is the Duke just trying to bury Deliritus under expectations? And I do wonder here, I'm interested to hear what you guys think. We starting to feel maybe the slightest bit of empathy for Deliritus now? Maybe, right? Clearly his father doesn't really treat him that fairly, but shoot me an email or leave me a comment. How are you feeling about Deliritus now after reading this chapter? And before we move over to chapter 6 here, just one final interesting note. We see Octavinal wasn't too pleased when Deliritus, as he puts it, ruined the best speaker this library has had since the burning. Now, he doesn't come right out and say it, but this is an obvious reference to Baz's brother, right? And, we actually see that maybe the Duke had a bit of a soft spot for Baz's brother, or, if not a soft spot, he at least valued him for the great services he was able to provide. The Duke makes us note he's against naming speakers, right? It creates needless attachment, he says. But then Delirious is like, well, you named Yeltax, didn't you, Dad? And Duke gets a little touchy there, right? That was different. We know Baz's brother was a rare breed of speaker, right? He was all three. He was a destroyer, creator, and influencer all in one. But was there more to it besides the Duke just, seeing his prize vase or sculpture, crushed by Deliritus? We don't know, but stay tuned. Obviously Duke valued Baz's brother enough to give him a name when he doesn't really think speakers should have them in general. All right, so that is chapter 5, and let's hop over to chapter 6 now. Right, onward, chapter 6. So we start off, we're back in the speaking room now, where chapters 1 and 2 took place, and Baz reminds us of that, noting he hates going in there because he always hears his brother's cries of pain when he does. So not a happy place for Baz to go, particularly now where he is still, lamenting. He's kind of in shock over what he just learned, that he's going on the trials here now. Chapter opens, Deliritus is practicing reading a spell with his uncle, right? This is the same uncle we saw in the last chapter who lost the duel. Salastair. And it seems, Deliritus has improved his reading here a little, right? That's kind of why I put this in here. He was really bungling around, right, 10 years ago in those scenes in part 1. But he's doing better here now. Uncle even congratulates him. And after that, maybe this is the first time we've seen a bit of maturity out of Deliritus, because he's not particularly pleased with this reading, right? Even, his uncle compliments him, but it's not like he's getting all happy about a compliment. He admits, I've only been practicing creation spells lately because he was going to be taking his creator to the trials. Basically kind of admitting he isn't really prepared for the trials. Interesting. Someone who's just, totally arrogant or aloof probably wouldn't say something like that. So, again, maybe Deliritus is, slowly paying off his his debt of terrible things here that we've seen him do to this point. Obviously, he still's got a long way to go. But and how does his uncle respond to Deliritus kind of saying he's not really ready? No comforting words, right? Basically, he tells Deliritus to go and hide somewhere. Stay away from the other speakers, particularly that Hellar Xavier, his uncle tells him. And he says, basically tells Deliritus Hellar is the best reader in Erstwhile. And Baz loves this plan, right? Okay, let's just hide in the countryside for a couple months. No, we'll just avoid the danger entirely. But now we got a bit of a reversal here in this scene from the torture chamber back in chapter 4. It's actually Deliritus now who's showing a little bit of courage, or maybe courage is too strong a word, but he's at least commitment to duty, or to his house here, right? The library's been struggling for the past decade, and he gets it, whether his father is pressuring him for good or ill reasons. Deliritus, understands a good showing in the trials would be great for a Torchsire Library. And I can't remember if I've actually referenced this in the book yet, but it's on the back cover, and we're going to learn this pretty soon if we haven't already. But since speakers can't read, they can't write either, right? So new spoken books are not being made anymore. So so finding a new one is a big deal. So competing in the trials and bringing back a book, like I said in the back cover, that's a big prize for a aspiring young reader here. So again, Deliritus grasps the importance of this journey he's about to go on. Uncle Salastair, though, being the encouraging relative, Deliritus, you are just outclassed. You'd be better off playing it safe than dying out there. And then he kind of just leaves. Deliritus kind of says, "We're done here, Uncle." And, Uncle doesn't apologize or say good luck or anything. He just leaves, like I've been saying, Deliritus, given us zero reason to sympathize with him so far. But now we've got, Dad treating him bad in the last chapter. Uncle, really... I guess Uncle is kind of trying to keep him alive at least, right? But still not really treating him that great. Certainly telling him, you're not good as hell, our Xavier. You shouldn't even be trying. And now we see, Deliritus also points out too, he's already competing against Hellar, who is considered like the best, the best reader apparently in the city. And then we've got Marla too, who is this crazy girl who likes watching people get tortured. And Deliritus seems pretty scared of her, just like Baz was. So he's got a lot being heaped on him here. So again, let me know how are you feeling about Deliritus now after these 2 chapters. Great. So Uncle's gone now, and finally Deliritus and Baz start interacting, which this is really, we saw them bickering in the torture chamber a little, but this is kind of the first real conversation we see between them. Or at least Deliritus is trying to have a conversation, right? But Baz isn't interested. He's slouching over there against the wall. He's kind of distraught, right? And like I said at the beginning of my analysis of this chapter, he's kind of in shock. He's about accompanying Deliritus on these trials here. And we do learn another reason for that. We already know the trials are dangerous. You're out in the wild. Baz mentioned earlier it's not uncommon for competitors to die during them. We also learn, though, that there's a rule that the readers aren't supposed to harm other readers, right? So there is kind of, it seems like there's probably few rules out here on the trials, and we'll get into some of the other rules here in a few chapters. But, readers aren't supposed to attack other readers, but there's no rule against hurting another reader's speaker. So it's possible Baz is going to become a target of Xavier, Hellar Xavier or Marla here once the trials start. If they can put Deliritus at a disadvantage and kill off his speaker, we see how important it is for someone to win these trials. So that seems a distinct possibility. So just another reason why Baz is so upset here. So things really are looking dire here. Deliritus is unprepared. Even if he's being treated unfairly, we saw how he reacted to that cityless who attacked him, right? So he's not the betting favorite here. That seems pretty certain. But even so, he kind of turns out to be the adult in this scene. He's trying to keep his tone bright. Baz, old chap, let's pick out some books together. Trying to get Baz to participate. But Baz, he's just like being a little petulant brat here a bit. Again, you can kind of understand. This is probably like the next worst thing to a death sentence in Baz's mind. With how dangerous these trials are going to be. But he goes through like describing how he glares at Deliritus. We can't look at him directly, but I'm just going to scowl over your shoulder, and then, I can get away with that, right? Like if Deliritus doesn't notice this. But, obviously Deliritus does, right? He sees how childish Baz is being, even, calls him out at the end for at the end of the chapter, threatening to have Rox teach him a lesson. Baz just keeps mouthing off to him. But did you catch something interesting there when at the end of the chapter, Deliritus threatens to have Rox teach Baz a lesson? And this is just making connections here again, back again to chapter 2. Remember Rox, when Deliritus initially told Rox to kill Tax. Rox took care to remind Deliritus, his oath is only to protect Deliritus from harm. So there is a limit to how vicious Rox is, right? He had to be harming Deliritus, or threatening him at least, before he'll come after you. And, just like it's important to have limits on how powerful magic is, having a limit on, some kind of wrecking ball like Rox is interesting. Too, Delirious is like, well, I'm going to sick Rox on you, Baz. And Rox kind of like turns around and is like, but he's not doing you any harm. And then, Delirious cuts him off. He doesn't want to hear it. But, again, Rox you can't just snap your fingers at Rox and he goes off and kills someone for no reason at all. So, you might not like Rox at this point, but he seems to have a code at least, right? Again, he's just not murdering on a whim. He's murdering to, protect Deliritous. All right, just a couple other quick items to touch on here, and then we'll be through with Chapter 6. This is a kind of a shorter chapter here. That's why I wanted to tack it on to Chapter 5. I got the 2 chapters in this week. We get a bit of a touching kind of, almost a soliloquy here from Deliritous, kind of a long block of text, in response to Baz's criticism over his failure to ever utilize Baz's ability as a speaker. We actually get a little bit of an explanation from Deliritous. We see Liana was kind of right about it, but, not entirely. I think I'm going to read that whole paragraph again, because I do think this kind of gives us an important glimpse into Deliritous here. So here we go. This is Deliritous responding to Baz. It's not that I don't trust you, Baztian. If anything, I trust you too much. I don't have any siblings myself, but I remember seeing my mother, well, another thing we don't need to speak of. But I know the relationship you had with poor old Yeltax, and you were here when I did, well, what I did. I did the best I could, after Father gave you to me. Lots of readers would have killed you, rather than go through the trouble of worrying over whether you might fry them each time you were read to. And I'm not certain I could entirely blame you for such a reaction. Don't you see? It was really the best for both of us, old chum, right? You not tempted to turn spells on me, and we both get to keep pumping the old heir in and out? Baz, of course, responds, he's not sympathizing with Deliritous, right? I don't know if anyone out there, any of you listeners out there are, but Baz certainly is not. A very kind of a reader not to murder a kid for being upset over watching what you did to his brother. And kind of a tough one here. I mean, I think maybe they're both making some valid points, at least in the context of this world. Deliritous does seem to have some genuine remorse over what he did to Tax. But Baz is kind of right here too. Delirious shouldn't be clapping himself on the shoulder for showing mercy to a little kid who just had his brother taken from him. And I like doing that. I think I do a decent job of that. I like to raise difficult questions, get you thinking a little. Again, Delirious is kind of a product of his environment here, right? So you do got to look at this in the context of the story. You've seen how some of these other readers are, and clearly they're worse than Deliritous. So, he did to Tax what he thought was right, given what the laws of this world are. And then, it's like he said, well, lots of other readers probably would have just killed Baz. And Delirious is like, look, I did everything I could to kind of keep you safe here, Baz. And, Baz clearly doesn't see it that way. But, Deliritous, at least in his head, thinks he was, doing something decent. I don't necessarily have an answer to that either. I'm not necessarily looking to give answers, but I like raising the issues and showing you both sides of difficult things, and then you guys can kind of come up with it on your own. That's one of the joys of reading, right? Coming up with your own interpretations, both just of imagining how things look, but kind of also your own interpretation of the meaning of certain things. I hope I achieve that every now and again here in my books. And just one last quick note here, and then we'll be done with Chapter 6. We've seen the elements referenced already, but Baz kind of drives home the 5 different types for the first time. So there's 5 magical elements here. We've got fire, earth, water, light, and shadow. Apparently each spoken book is based off of one of these elements, and, they each kind of do different things. And it seems, this is hinted at very vaguely, but, it seems like maybe certain speakers are better with certain elements, because Deliritous is asking Baz, well, how do you feel about earth power or water power or light power? And then he pulls out the shadow book, right? And that's apparently dangerous. Baz is like, put that thing away before you hurt yourself, Deliritous. And Delirious is like, well, I've seen Marla vaporize rats with shadow spells. So, we'll learn a little more about the power of shadow magic here a little later on in the book, but kind of nasty stuff here. You see Delirious is kind of like holding it out like the book might bite him or something. So clearly it's not just Baz who's worried about it. And mostly this is kind of just like an interesting detail for now, but the different elements do become more and more important the deeper we get into the Spoken Books Uprising series. And all right, that's it. So 2 more chapters down. Very good. We are chugging along here. Next week, we're going to finish up part 2 of the book by reading chapter 7, which is a decently long chapter. We're going to learn a lot more stuff here. So Baz is going to go down to the sub-basement where the Duke's retired speakers live. And we're going to see Liana again down there. See some more interaction between Baz and Liana. We'll see her workshop where she works on restoring spoken books down in the basement of Torchsire Library. And then we get a surprise after that. And I'm interested to see if how many of you out there were truly surprised by it, and whether you think this is a fair surprise or maybe I was hiding the ball a bit too much. I think it's a fair one if you've been paying close attention, but obviously I'm a little biased, so let me know what you think. We're also going to learn some interesting things about singing and tattoos. What do you think the significance of those 2 things are after you've read chapter 7? You'll get some good hints here, but again, no express answers. So that's your homework for the week, and always, if you don't do it, that is okay, because I'll be doing it all for you next week. All right, listener questions. Got one here from Linda in New York. And, Linda has been hearing me give my personal updates at the beginning of each episode. And she hears that I have 3 books in the hopper right now. This one we're reading, and then 2 others in various stages of editing. And she's just wondering, how I managed to write so many books so quickly. Thanks for the question, Linda. And I'm laughing a little now at the question, but I am a little amused by your characterization of a lot of books, because there are some self-published authors out there that pump out a book a month. So in some circles, I would be considered a rather slow writer here. But I understand by most people's standards, writing 3 books in a year probably seems impossible. But you just got to have a process and a consistent routine, and you really need to break it into small chunks. Sitting down and just thinking I have to write a whole novel, that's going to feel like an impossible task. It's like thinking, well, I gotta climb up to the top of Mount Everest in 1 mile. You get to the Mount Everest one step at a time, and same thing with writing. You get to a finished novel one page at a time, or even one word at a time. I'm not the best at math here, but let me just type some numbers into the old calculator here. If you write as few as 250 words a day, that's 91,250 words in a year. And that's a good-sized novel. That's actually almost exactly how long the Acktus Trials is, 91,000 words, thereabouts. And that comes out to, let's see, how many pages is the print book? I've got it now. I can see. It is 321 pages. So there you go, 250 words a day. That's like, a couple of paragraphs, really. So, and the consistency is really what matters about it. I'm up in my office writing pretty much every day after work. Work ends between 5 and 6 most days, and then I make dinner, spend a little time with my wife, and then from like 7 to 9, sometimes a little later than 9, I'm writing away most nights. And I write more than 250 words, so triple that, even 750 words There you go, 390,000 word books in a year, which is what I did back in 2021. I wrote wrote three full length novels, but it's really, like I said, I know I feel like I've said the word consistency 100 times here. I'm consistent about saying consistency, but getting the butt in the chair and writing is important. And I do find, you got to find strategies too to keep the engine going. So sometimes I'll actually like sit down with pen and paper and just jot down ideas for a chapter in the morning, and then when I sit down to write in the evening, it's like I've already started the creative process. I don't have to start with the blank page. I've got my notes, and I'm like, okay, this is where the chapter's going. I've already got it thought out, and I've just got to expand on my my bullet points. So I do think, there's pantsers and plotters, right? Pantsers, you're writing by the seat of your pants and not thinking things. You're not planning things out ahead of time. It's like, well, I'm just going to sit down and write, and the story will go where it goes. I know lots of people have great success with that, but I don't do that. I sit down, I've got a whole outline, and don't get me wrong, it's not like I don't have like 100-page outline that's like as long as the book. But I've got an outline of most of the scenes, so I can sit down and see, okay, I'm at this point in the outline, so okay, well that happens, and then between my kind of high-level outline and then my handwritten notes that I've jotted down a lot of the time about the chapter, I can get going pretty quick, and part of it too is I've got stories upon stories up here in the old noggin. Sometimes it's frustrating that I can't get them out as quickly as I want to, and the only way they're going to get out is if I sit down and do the work. And I like this quote, you are what you do every day, right? And I want to be a writer, so I've got to do my writing every day. So there you go, Linda. Thanks for that question. Sorry, I kind of rambled there a little bit, but again, hopefully you guys like hearing that kind of that behind the scenes look. All right, so this week's quest. I'd love to hear, what do you think the inciting incident of the novel was? I feel pretty comfortable we've gotten to it at this point. I'm actually personally kind of torn between, was it the cityless attack or Octavinal's announcement that Deliritous is going to be taking Baz on the trials? Those are kind of the two that I'm torn between. And this is more of an academic exercise, really. I don't think it really matters. You could argue, well, it's all just one big thing, The cityless attacking Delilah leads to Octavinal saying that. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. What's the inciting incident? Or maybe you could think, maybe you can make an argument for something else other than those two things. I'm just interested to hear what people think. So, and for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with literary terms, the inciting incident, it's the thing that propels you into the story, right? Dorothy getting picked up in the tornado and brought over to Oz. The tornado there is the inciting incident, or, Katniss's sister being picked for the Hunger Games. There's the inciting incident that propels Katniss into the rest of the story, out of your ordinary world and into the story. So this is another one. No right answer to this one, guys. Send me your thoughts and you'll complete this quest. We'll make this one 2 experience points. So I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about that. All right, and that brings us to our quote of the week as we finish the episode every week. This one comes from William Goldman, who wrote The Princess Bride. When I was your age, television was called books. I like that. I certainly read more books than I watch TV, I think, and I certainly write more than I watch TV, too. Going back to our listener question there, I'm not down there watching TV in the evening. I'm up in my office writing away. So, if you've ever thought about writing a book, how many TV shows do you watch in a year? Could you replace some of that TV watching with some writing? You gotta decide what you want. And that's I'm not totally criticizing TV either.
I've watched a few TV episodes in the past year. But I pick and choose. I make sure I really want to watch something. So keep that binging to a healthy minimum. Unless, of course, it's D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club that you're binging. In that case, I highly approve that choice. So until next time, until your next binge fest here, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club.
The contestants were Deliritus's and Trivinal. Trivinal, I think. Trivinal. And Trivinal. Yeah. Not ready, the Duke, said the Duke. Ah, man, I don't... La do. Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.